If you like to delete entire rooms full of enemies with just the press of a single button, then boy do I have your new favorite melee in Warframe. That's right, today we will talk about the brand new Dual Viciss, which I think is easily one of the best melees in the game right now. We're gonna go over how it works, what makes it so incredibly good, and I even have multiple builds and powerful synergies that I want to show you. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, well, let's jump right into it. Alright, first of all, let's talk about where you can actually get the Dual Viciss in case you want to have it for yourself, and this is relatively simple and shouldn't take all too long. You can get the main blueprint as well as the component blueprints from Minerva in the Helvania Mall. The main blueprint costs 15,000 standing with the hex, and the component blueprints cost 5,000 each. Only thing to keep in mind here would be that you need to be rank 5 with the hex in order to be able to purchase this, and in case you don't want to go and farm it for yourself, then of course you can also always buy it in the market for platinum. But now that you know how you can get it for yourself, how about we start talking about what these things can actually do and why they are so special. See, the Dual Viciss count as dual swords and therefore are part of a relatively big melee group in the game, having access to, of course, all the stances that come with it. However, outside of the relatively good stats that we're going to talk about in a second here, the Dual Viciss has a unique trait that sets it apart massively from other dual swords, and that is that for every gas status effect that you trigger, you gain plus 8% movement speed as well as plus 7% attack speed for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, so we're talking about plus 40% movement speed and plus 35% attack speed. This is a super nice buff given the fact that you don't even have to mod to get it, and as we will soon see, the condition of triggering gas status effects is likely going to be met 99% of the time, so this thing will be up constantly. But now that we're already talking about gas status effects and attack speed, let's also talk about the weapon stats in general, and these look very nice. First of all, the Dual Viciss has the highest total base damage of all dual swords in the game with 255, and the great thing here is that 153, so 60% of it, is innate gas damage, meaning you don't have to mod for it. This whole thing then is combined with a very good 29% status chance, so you see why I said that the unique trait of triggering gas status effects is probably gonna happen all the time. But not only is the Dual Viciss a status monster, it also comes with a very decent 23% crit chance at a 2.1x multiplier. This allows it to not only be modded into status, but into a very strong hybrid weapon. In fact, when we compare the Dual Viciss with other dual swords in the game, then we see that not only does it have the highest innate base damage of all of them, if we go ahead and filter the list for damage per second, then it comes in at rank 2, only being outclassed by the Dual Carries Prime. However, the only reason why the Dual Carries Prime is higher is that it has 25% more attack speed. But this spreadsheet is a bit misleading because for the Dual Viciss, they took the base attack speed of 1.0 for this comparison, even though you're expected to constantly have that 35% attack speed bonus from the unique trait. So what would be more realistic here is calculated with a 1.35 times animation speed, and that then would mean that the Dual Viciss not only has the highest base damage of all dual swords, but also the highest base damage per second. So you can see, we're not just talking about a gimmicky weapon, this thing actually comes in really strong. And as always, it will be super strong from you to leave this video a little like, because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. And now, let's talk about building the darn things, shall we? Alright, let's talk builds, and the first thing I want to address with the builds is stance mods. Which stance mod should you use on the Dual Viciss? Luckily, you are very free to do whatever you like. The selection of which stance to go for usually relies on whether you want to force proc slashes or not, and then you just pick whichever has the best slash application. But given the fact that this is a gas weapon and we don't really care about slash, we also don't really care about which stance mod you use. I personally chose Swirling Tiger, but I also tested a couple others and I couldn't find all too much of a difference in performance, so don't stress yourself out about it. Next, and this in my opinion is very important to discuss before actually taking a look at the build setups, would be how exactly gas status effects in Warframe even work. The first thing we need to make ourselves very clear is that gas is only limited to a maximum of 10 procs per enemy. Other damage over time effects, like for example heat, can stack up infinitely. So for example, if you were attacking an enemy with heat, it wouldn't make all too much of a difference whether you go for one really big heat proc or 1,000 small ones. Both would be possible, both would be the same outcome. With gas though, once you have 10 elemental status effects of gas on the enemy, once you deal another one, it just replaces the oldest gas proc, meaning the overall gas damage over time cannot be increased infinitely. You will only ever have 10 gas procs and the damage that those gas procs deal, and not more. What does that mean for us? Well, in practice, this means that when you go for gas, you rather have fewer big gas procs rather than 1,000 small ones, because once you overcap on gas application, your gas damage over time won't increase anymore, so you gotta make every single proc count. However, that's not the only important thing to keep in mind about gas. Another one would be how this gas damage over time is even calculated in the first place. See, this right here is the damage formula for your gas proc damage per tick. And even though this might sound a little bit mathematical and complicated, what we see here is actually very simple and telling. Because what we can read out of this is that the gas damage over time that our gas clouds deal is only based on our modded base damage, our faction damage bonuses, status damage bonus coming from an elementalist mod, as well as critical damage multipliers, and, very funny, gas can actually headshot, but given the fact that this is a melee weapon, that's probably not really applicable to our case today. Now, why is this important to know? Relatively simple, because it means that the gas damage over time excludes all mods giving elemental damage bonus. So if you, for example, were to go and mod even more gas on the daggers, thinking that this will increase your gas damage over time, then that is actually not happening. Instead, when you want to optimize your DOT with this, you rather go for more base damage and more crit damage instead. So yeah, long story short, what we need to keep in mind with gas is try to deal fewer big hits rather than a lot of small ones, and don't mod all too much elemental damage on the weapon because it will not have any influence on our gas damage over time. And with all that being said, let's finally talk about how to build, starting out with the arcane selection. And when it comes to which arcanes we should use here, then there is a very clear favorite, which to nobody's surprise would be, of course, melee influence. I don't think I need to explain all too much why it is very good to spread elemental status effects throughout the entire room on a gas-heavy weapon, but yeah, melee influence is without a doubt the best build on this weapon, deleting entire rooms of enemies no problem. This right here would be a generic melee influence build that you can easily use on any Warframe out there. However, given the fact that for melee influence we need to have electricity in order to trigger it, that means in this generic build we of course have to mod for electricity. But if you were to play a setup where you have external electricity application, for example by using Volt Skill Shock with the Shock Trooper Augment, then you can leave the electricity on the weapon out and rather go with something like this instead. However, even though melee influence is probably the best option for this weapon, it is not the only viable one. Another one that you could go for, which I think is pretty strong and unfortunately underrated, would be melee vortex, because this allows you to group up enemies, and especially for gas weapons, grouping up enemies is incredibly strong because that means that the gas clouds of every individual enemy overlap, exponentially increasing the damage per second on each and every one of them. Only prerequisite here would be that the enemies have to be afflicted by magnetic, otherwise you will not group them up. And here you can either go for this build in the background, which already includes magnetic, or you could leave the magnetic mod out, replace it with more damage or something, and go for some sort of external magnetic priming. The arcane doesn't state that the magnetic proc has to come from the melee weapon, it just says the enemy has to have magnetic on them the moment they die. Now, so much for the builds, but before we wrap it up for today, I also want to give you a couple of Warframe and synergy suggestions that would work really nicely with these melees. Starting out with, of course, the king of melee weapons in Warframe, Culervo. As I previously said, since we are only able to ever stack a maximum of 10 gas effects on an enemy, we need to make sure that every single gas effect deals as much damage as possible. And naturally, having tier 3 red crits or something, that is a sure way to make those gas procs stronger. So yeah, naturally, Kullervo, Wrathful Advance, this is a godsend. However, there is one thing you need to keep in mind with this, and that is that ideally, you want to play the man himself and not just subsume Wrathful Advance over something else on another frame, because when you use Kullervo, you have the advantage that Kullervo has a relatively high heavy attack efficiency, meaning whenever you trigger or re-trigger your Wrathful Advance, you're not losing all your combo. And this is important because you need your combo counter since you're using Weeping Wounds for the status chance, and if you were to use Wrathful Advance on just any other Warframe, then this would reset your combo counter back to 0 every time you trigger it. Therefore, you probably wouldn't be able to get your combo multiplier in the double digits, and that wouldn't be ideal for a status chance weapon. Another very strong option here would be Varuna. And this is my personal favorite here actually, Volt, because he not only can infuse the electricity damage that you need to trigger melee influence with the augment for his first skill, but he also delivers movement speed as well as attack speed, therefore he performed very nice in my tests with the Dual Viciss. And lastly, since we are talking about gas clouds, and gas clouds, if they happen to be in the same place, can overlap and deal scaling damage, this means that naturally any grouping ability infused with the helmet, or any Warframe that has an innate grouping ability, will like this weapon very, very, very much. Specifically, I think Mag and Nidus are optimal here. Korra does work too, but given the fact that her pull is a bit slower, I don't think it's that amazing. But especially Nidus's larva and Mag's pull are great to group up a lot of enemies into one tight spot, and if all of them then spawn gas clouds at the same time, the damage that this deals is not only absolutely mental, you can also go and pull in even more enemies into this gas cloud, which will then also instantly delete them. As for companions, it's a relatively black and white option. If you're playing a Warframe that has an innate grouping ability, then go for any type of companion that can inflict a lot of different status effects to give you the most damage possible through your condition overload. And if you play a frame who doesn't have a grouping ability, then of course, no question, you go for Nautilus, so Nautilus can group the enemies up for you. And if you also want to see how Excalibur got super broken strong with the new update, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Hoke Hunter, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.